Quite, actually. It was a rather surprising move, especially since that there had been a similar case that the DA had instituted in court against the SABC. And in that case, there are two separate judgments that have very, very different views about exactly what the powers of the public protector are. There is the Supreme Court of Appeal judgment, which basically avers the position that the EFF lawyers took. But then again, there is the High Court judgment. And the High Court actually took a view that really could have been in support of the president, arguably, if one interpreted that judgment very broadly. So it was rather surprising that they actually effectively conceded the absolute binding effect of the public protector's report.
From where you sit, I mean, someone like me who's a layman, I would have thought that even though they would concede at the end of the day, I would have thought that they would have at least flagged some critical issues. Were there simply no issues, or did they just think, let's forget about it?
I mean, it may have been a matter of strategy. So you're reading the bench and you know your audience, and perhaps they just think that it wasn't worth the time to waste on that, and rather maybe they can get concessions elsewhere. But really there are actual reasons to be concerned about overbroad powers being given to the public protector. I mean, our constitutional scheme really does envisage what we would call a separation of powers. And that's not just a principle that applies to the president and to courts and the legislature, but also to Chapter 9 institutions. We need their powers to be carefully circumscribed whilst still being effective. And the kind of argument brought forward by both the EFF lawyers and the DA's lawyers call for a very radical interpretation of what the public protector's powers are. And we all have to remember that ultimately institutions outlive their current occupants. So what happens when someone of less ethical or moral fiber than Thuli Madonsela occupies the office of the public protector? Remember, her term as public protector is soon coming to an end, and it's non-renewable. What then? Who chooses the public protector? It's obviously the National Assembly, the ANC-led government. So we need to be careful when we give overbroad powers to a particular personality just simply because of their moral standing. We actually have to think beyond the facts of this case. And it calls for a lot of concern that there wasn't much discussion about that point in the court today.
But why should that be an issue if one takes into account, I mean, why do we have a public protector in the first instance? Is it not because we have to protect the most vulnerable in society? So why should the focus be on curtailing their powers instead of giving them more, for argument's sake?
Well, this is also because judgments also outlive the current court as well. So we can't all just simply rely on the fact that the public protector is designed to protect the interests of the very, very vulnerable. The real question is about how far she can go in protecting that vulnerable group. No one before the court today was in any way disputing the fact that the public protector's powers have to be effective, to use the words of the EFF's lawyer, Mr. Trengrove. However, the question of how effective is still up for debate. The constitutional text is not very clear about that. It only calls for appropriate remedial action. And even before it gets to that, it specifically says that Parliament may regulate the powers of the public protector. So all of this is still very ambiguous, and the only way we can go about trying to figure out what it means is that we actually have to consider all the interests at work here. The interests that work in favor of the public protector and for a broader reading of her powers, but also the interests that actually call for a rather more moderate interpretation of her powers. We can't always just jump the gun, as it were, and just simply decide the facts in favor of the position we already hold. The Constitution itself must guide us.